The Blood of the Grape. Just as the sun was throwing his last beams low on the bosom of our bay, and the slow shades of approaching night were creeping solemnly over the wavy waters, the steamer Malvoisie was passing Cape Schanck. There was a strong eastern bis south breeze blowing, and the man at watch up in the Cape Schanck lighthouse saw the steamer with interest as the signals were hoisted and the telegraph operator sent quick-winged words up to Melbourne that the Malvoisie had passed the Heads. As the steamer careened to the wind and showed her sea-stained copper bottom to the watchman, in whose charge was the wonderful mechanism of the revolving light in Cape Schanck lighthouse, the waves rolled round her, and the foam splashed up against her bows, as if angry that she was to leave the blue waves so soon. The smoke of her funnels drifted slowly away on the sea and amalgamated with the low gathering mist, until you could not distinguish one from the other. Yet what a difference there is between smoke and mist. The steamer was a seabird that had swam 12 or 13,000 miles over the great solitary ocean to bring beating hearts and many hopes to this wonderful Australia of ours. Her bosom had breasted many fierce storms, her plumage had been ruffled and drenched by 100 winds, her heart had beaten steadily through it all in quick panting gasps when the hard storm of the Cape made her scud under courses, and softly as the heart of a sleeping bird when nothing opposed her steady purpose, and she swam to the north of lone Kerguelen land. She had beaten and overcome all, storm and calm, wind and wave, and here she was safely within a few hours of her haven. Ah, some of us would give more than we possess for the steady purpose and indomitable determination to reach our goal displayed by the seabird Malvoisie. "It's wonderful," said the watcher at Cape Schanck, as in his huge lamp, with the wind making thunder around him, and his beautiful revolving apparatus going like a human life below, he watched the Malvoisie roll to and fro on the big waves, yet keep her steady course onward. "She seems so near that you could pitch a stone into her from the priest's cave, yet I dare say she is in her courses." But he said it doubtfully, and with a shake of the head. You see, our friend of the lighthouse was not a pilot. On the deck of the Malvoisie, many anxious eyes were strained up the bay, and many voluminous tongues were calculating the time it would take them to reach Melbourne. There were two persons, however, whose thoughts lay deeper than many words, one by nature, the other by repression. They stood together near a bulwark, a tall, strong, fair-haired man of about 30, and graceful yet self-reliant woman of, say, 27. She gazed with a yearning, eager gaze onward. He looked at Cape Schanck and the wonderful revolving light becoming each moment brighter as the darkness grew on the water. "So we shall soon part, mademoiselle, I presume," the tall, strong, fair man said at last to the silent woman, who gazed toward Melbourne. "Yes, I suppose so, Mr. Morris," was the rather absent reply. "And are you glad to reach the end of our journey? I am sure I know I am. Such a life! Who would be a sailor? Have you any friends to meet you, mademoiselle?" "No." "But see here, that will never do," cried Morris, as with his hands in his pockets, he turned suddenly facing her. "I understand that even yet Melbourne swarms with people who will take all sorts of advantage of one. What can you do among such without friends?" "I have an object," she replied quietly. "And an object may lead a determined woman to the very gates of death itself." He looked at her with a wondering expression on his shrewd, handsome features. She was looking again straight up the darkening bay, as though burning to be at their destination. "I have never understood you," he said, as he looked at the firm, dark, sharply cut French face. "Though people who make such a long voyage as we have done in company generally get to know a good deal of each other's characters. But you have been strangely reticent, and I have tried to be a gentleman. Now, however, I have one word to say. If it is in the power of an honest man to help you in this strange land, you have but to ask Charles Morris, and he will give it to you." "You are very good," was all she said, and in such a cold tone that impulsively Charlie Morris turned on his heel and walked to the farthest end of the quarterdeck. "Well now," he soliloquized, "I'm vexed about that woman. There's something evidently wrong about her. I mean, as to her being troubled. Yet she's so like an oyster that you might as well try to get her troubles out of her as though she were a bivalve. and I've not got the oyster knife, you see. I wonder if Clements will be sure to meet me. I shall be like a fish out of water in this much talked of Melbourne, of which, after all, we know of far less than we do of the Sandwich Islands." Meanwhile, the lady known as Mademoiselle St. Clair stood still as though she had been a statue of stone, and not a warm, breathing, boiling, living vengeance. Her dark face was stony, her hands clutched hard the rail of the bulwark. She never saw that face of grand rock where, by the continual hard winds from the 1,000 miles wide sea, the lime sota, as I have heard some wondrously clever people call it, is shaved as close as if a scythe had gone over it. She never saw the soft white patches of rock moss below. She never saw the narrow beach under the priest's cave. She never saw the Eagle's Nest Rock, which the captain pointed out to interested passengers. She never saw that huge lamp where the watcher stood and watched the passing Malvoisie above the wonderful mechanism of his revolving lights. She saw nothing around her. Her mind was occupied by the object she had spoken of. What was it? The Malvoisie did not berth until the next morning, and when looking a perfect picture of English strength and manhood, Charlie Morris stepped to the pier, his hand was grasped by his friend Clements. Clements was a short, wiry and rather gentlemanly-looking man of, perhaps, Charlie Morris's age, and he was dressed in such an odd loose style that Charlie stared at him, not being used to colonial attire, you see. Not that Morris himself had any pretensions to being a dandy. His attire was a simple suit of tweed, but then it was tweed which the first tailor in London had manipulated, and which, while being that of a perfect gentleman, gave full and easy play to his fine figure and perfect muscular development. "Welcome to Australia, Morris. I am glad to see a schoolmate's face once more," the Australian said, as he gripped the hand of his expected friend. Yet while he was speaking, the sharp eyes were wandering over the numerous passengers landing, and among the luggage being landed. "What the deuce is he staring about like that for?" thought Charlie to himself. "I'm rather afraid it's true what we heard about colonial manners." But he only said aloud, "Are you expecting anyone else, Clements?" "Yes, I don't know. Where are you going to put up? I advise Menzies, it's your style. You'll find any cabman will take you there." And still the sharp eyes roved restlessly through the noisy crowd. "Well, I'm blowed," thought Charlie to himself, but he said coldly, "Good morning, Mr. Clements. I daresay I've got a purse in my pocket I shall be able to house myself in Victoria." "Now come, Charlie, don't be a fool," cried Clements, seizing him by the arm as he was moving away. "Duty is duty, you know, and you mustn't expect here the same preux chevalier sort of manners you meet with on the Continent. I have another duty to perform here before I can devote myself entirely to you. Believe me, I shall be at your service in the course of 3/4 of an hour." "Duty? What do you mean, Clements?" "In the name of all greenhorns, didn't you know I'm a detective?" cried Clements, turning for one instant his wondering eyes on Morris. "After that, I'm blowed." And then the sharp eyes resumed their watch. "A detective?" echoed Morris, and then he said no more aloud, but to himself, "My schoolmate at rugby, and poor old Canon Clement's son." At this moment stepped on the gangway of the Malvoisie a small slender figure in deep mourning. She carried a valise of black American cloth in her hand, and she had a dark, foreign-looking, stony-like face. Clements advanced quickly as she stepped on the pier, and laid his hand lightly on her arm. "You're Mademoiselle St. Clair?" he asked questioningly. "Assuredly," she answered haughtily. "Take your hand from my arm, sir." "I arrest you in the name of the Queen, mademoiselle. You will please accompany me," and he beckoned to 2 ready policemen. "Arrest me?" The dark face flushed to deep scarlet. "May I ask for what?" "I arrest you on warrant of a charge of forgery," Clements answered, "and I am bound to warn you that anything you may say will be used against yourself." "Oh, mon Dieu!" was all she said, as she fell against the rail of the gangway. But indignant Charlie Morris stepped forward and addressed Clements haughtily. "Can nothing be done in this, sir? Can no bail be offered?" "None, my dear fellow. It is a charge of felony." "If," cried Morris indignantly, "I were such a one as you, I would kill myself. You are a hound." "A sleuth hound? Yes," Clements replied, as his prisoner was handed over to the charge of the policeman. And you might be glad of one on your track presently. I shall see you soon, Charlie Morris." "Not if I know it," said Morris, as he turned to see his first of Melbourne. "Good heavens! Before I'd come to that, I'd break stones." We are all liable to be désillusionnés at times, and the day came when Charlie Morris was désillusionné as regarded the detective force of Victoria. It so happened that, on the morning of the arrival at the pier of the Malvoisie, 2 mounted men were getting ready to return to their stations. The name of one was Clem Pennoyer, the name of the other Pat Frostbrook. At 6 in the morning they were busily engaged in currying and otherwise getting ready their several horses, and they were talking. "If you'd thought much of your leg," said Clem angrily, "you'd be only too glad to have the use of it, and go back to your station." "Me legs were a more use to me than ever yours were, Clem Pennoyer, for I can shake 'em on a floor and you can't. But for all that I'd give the tops of me best toes to stop in Melbourne for the opening of the exhibition." "You're a fool," simply replied Clem, as he saddled his horse. "Of course I am, and always was," cried Pat. "And what's more, I mane to be one as far as wishin' for diversion's concerned. Now have ye a word to say to that, Clem Pennoyer?" The Irishman's attitude was suggestive. He had dropped the saddle and turned fiercely toward his mate, with one fist strangely near poor Clem's nose. "I have no coach to waste trailing around Donnybrook Fair," Clem said coolly. "And you're a fool, Pat Frostbrook." "Be dad, I believe I am," Pat said as he reduced his fist to the necessity of saddling his horse. "But it's a good name anyway, and a name that a king needn't be ashamed of. At the same time, Clem Pennoyer, it's a shame. Just when we've had a chance of seeing 14 emperors, 24 kings and 64 knights of Jerusalem opening the great exhibition, I'm to be pulled back like an old rag to Tatura. Sure, I thought we'd be all on guard there." "Mount your horse and get out of this," Clem cried angrily. "Whoever has been stuffing your foolish head with such ideas beats me, but if I did know, I'd choke him." 14 emperors, 24 kings and 64 knights of Jerusalem," repeated poor Pat, as he stuck one foot in the stirrup. "If you say one more word, I'll report you," shrieked Clem, riding out of the gate. "It's a fine name, that same Pennoyer," Pat said as he followed him, "but I'd rather be a Frostbrook and see 14 emperors, 24 kings and 64 knights of Jerusalem open the great Melbourne exhibition." "Shut up!" Clem cried angrily, as he saw approaching them a hansom with a decided intention of visiting the Richmond depot. "Divil a shut up then," Pat retorted. "Sure, me leg's better anyhow." "Of all the fools," Clem had begun, when the hansom pulled up suddenly. "Is this the Richmond Police Depot?" a gentleman asked, a gentleman dressed in London cut tweed and with a fair handsome face, as he quickly descended from the vehicle. "Yes," cried Pennoyer abruptly, as he drew up his curvetting horse close to the vehicle. "Yes, sir," cried Pat Frostbrook, "and it's here I got my leg broke wid the kick of a horse, and was laid up in hospital for 7 weeks. I'm blessed if they let me put my foot to ground all the time, and more, betoken, my heel's sore. But I wouldn't care a course if they let me see the opening of the great exhibition. 14 emperors, 24 kings, 64 knights of Jerusalem." "For heaven's sake, get back to quarters, Frostbrook," Clem said as he dismounted. "Excuse him, sir, I believe the man's mad." "What is the matter with him?" Charlie Morris asked, a strong, stalwart, breeze-blown English figure with a cigar between his fair moustached lips. "The matter is simply, sir, that he's a fool, naturally so being an Irishman. He had, as he has told you, a kick from a horse about 6 weeks ago, and has been in our hospital. He used, it seems, to be the best step dancer at Tatura, and it seems to have fallen on his brain. Now his folly has taken a turn, and he wants to stop for the opening of the exhibition." "Did you say Tatura?" the young gentleman from England asked. "Yes, he is stationed there, and is just on his way home to his station." "Then I may say that my business here is accomplished," said our Charlie Morris. "If you will be kind enough to ask Constable Frostbrook to permit me to accompany him to Tatura, I shall be more than grateful." 14 emperors, 24 kings and 64 knights of Jerusalem," muttered Pat, but when he heard mention of Tatura, he drew up his horse close beside Charlie. "Did you say Tatura, sir? Well, I'm your man, sure I'm going there, it's me station." "We will go together," Charlie said with a smile, as he looked in the honest face of the Irishman, "and it's quite possible that you and I might both yet see the opening of the Melbourne Exhibition." 14 Emperors, 24 Kings and 64 Knights of Jerusalem, Pat said as he dismounted beside Charlie. "Begorra, it's myself that's glad to have company to Tatura. Can you dance a jig, sir? A rale Irish jig?" "I think I can, Constable. It'll go hard with me if we don't get up a jolly good dance at Tatura." "To the devil I pitch ye all, Clem and Emperors and Kings and the rest of ye av Jerusalem!" Pat shrieked in delight as he remounted his restive horse. Get in, sir, and I'll lay it all out for ye." Pat Fosbrook was not half such a fool as Clem Pennoyer thought him. His advice as to Mr. Morris's best procedure was sound. At about 2 o'clock of that same day 2 horsemen were within as many miles as Tatura. The horsemen were Charlie Morris and Pat Fosbrook. "Now, sir," the latter said, pointing to a great southern slope of vineyard just gathering green from the warming sun. "That's the place you're bound for, that's Tatura Vineyard." "I think I shall go straight there," Morris said. "Mr. Smallburn expects me. I wrote to him by the last mail. Do you think it probable that Mr. Smallburn will be at home?" "Devil a one of me thinks he's ever far from the cellar," Pat said. "I'd lay an even bet that it's there you'll find him." "In the cellar? What do you mean?" "The place where they keep the wine, Mr. Morris. Oh, you'll soon know all about it. Well, here's the gate. Would you like me to escort you up, like?" "Oh, that will not be necessary, thank you. And the township of Tatura, is that it down there on the side of the hill? What a lovely place it is." "Yes, sir, that's Tatura. And do you see that white place wid all the green stuff around it? Well, that's the police station where I'm to be found most days of the week. For devil such a quiet place as Tatura you'll find in the colony, more's the pity. And do you see that brick house on the rise? Well, that's Vance's, the best drink, Mr. Morris, and the finest barmaid." "And the place we're to have our dance, I see," Charlie said, with one of his bright smiles, as they pulled up before a low, broad, white-painted gate. "Well, Constable Fosbrook, get up the affair, and only let me know when it comes off. Make it as great a colonial success as you can. I give you carte blanche." "You'll give me what, sir?" asked Fosbrook, staring at Charlie with his mouth open. Morris laughed a hearty, genial laugh. "I mean, my dear fellow, that you can arrange it all and come to me for the money you want." "Ah, bedad, I understand that anyhow," cried Pat jubilantly, as he slapped his leg. "And you may believe me, Mr. Morris, that I won't let the grass grow under me feet about that same ball. Begorra, you're a brick, sir. But honestly now, Mr. Morris, do you think my leg's much crooked?" And he turned out the said limb and looked wistfully at it. "Honestly, I do not see the least difference between the two," replied Charlie. "I only hope it is quite strong enough to enjoy our prospective ball." "It's as sound as a trivet," Pat cried. "Would you like to see a step, Mr. Morris? Bedad, if you would say the word, and I'll go down and give you one on the road." Laughingly declining the compliment, Charlie rode through the gate Pat opened for him and shut behind him, and they parted with mutual and sincere compliments. It may be well believed that to one fresh from the blue skies and thorn hedges of England, to ride up half a mile of avenue between trellises of lovely green vines, with the fresh air and budding verdure saluting his senses, and a sky blue as turquoise above his head, was a delightful experience to Charles Morris. Yet he was thinking so much of his old friend Smallburn, and so full of wonder at what change he should find in him, that he noticed little of the beauty around him. Soon he came in sight of the house, a pretty low stone house, with vine-wreathed verandas and porticos covered with a flush of roses. Behind, on the slope among the vines, were several other low stone buildings, one of which, though Charlie Morris did not know it, was the cellar. His arrival was observed, and a man came out to meet him, respectfully touching his hat as he approached. "I am at Mr. Smallburn's place, am I not?" Morris asked. "Yes, sir." "Is Mr. Smallburn at home?" "Mr. Smallburn?" "Yes, sir." "Well, you can take my horse. If you will show me the way to Mr. Smallburn, I will go to him. I wish to take him by surprise." "Yes, sir. Are you the gentleman from England the master is expecting?" "I am." "Oh, master will be delighted, sir. This way, if you please, sir." past the rose-wreathed verandas and the long, low Venetian-blinded windows of the house, around which the stillness of the sunny spring day seemed to brood, and up toward the cellar, with its thick stone walls and slate roof, Mr. Morris followed his guide. The door of this building was open, and the man pointed to it. "You'll find Mr. Smallburn inside, sir." With interested and wondering eyes, Charlie entered the building. Long ranges of great casks on trestles made, as it were, aisles adown the building, and the pleasant freshness of cool air and the rich scent of wines greeted Morris as he entered. Wondering where he should find his friend, he travelled down one of the aisles, and, before he had proceeded far, he saw lying upon a couch the figure of a sleeping man. It was a strange place to choose for a couch or for rest. Under one of the ventilators that admitted light as well as air, and in the shadow of a huge cask that held easily its 1,000 gallons of the blood of the grape, the couch was placed. Close to it was drawn a small table, on which were conspicuous several bottles with short and long necks, and a tumbler or two. The gentleman lying asleep was not tall, but broad-chested and strong-limbed. He had black hair and heavy eyebrows, and he lay on his back with both hands under his head. Morris stood and looked at the strange changes barely 7 years had made in his friend. When he saw him last, in an English home, he was a pleasant, pale-faced young man of 24, one of the best oarsmen and cricketers of his county. He found him a besotted-looking man of more than his age, and with a hard, ferocious look on even his sleeping face. He moaned and muttered in his sleep, and started and ground his teeth, so that Charlie felt it a charity to awaken him. He laid his hand on Smallburn's arm and slightly shook him. The sleeper started almost to his feet at one bound, and he trembled from head to foot like a leaf in the wind. He stared at Charlie as though he had been a ghost, until at last his scattered senses collected themselves, and he saw a strange gentleman before him. "Good heavens, how you startled me!" he exclaimed, as he fell back into a sitting posture to the couch, and wiped the big drops from his forehead. "I must have been dreaming." "You were indeed," Morris said quietly. "I thought it a kindness to awaken you." Smallburn poured out a great tumbler of wine from one of the bottles on the table, and drank it at a draught. Then he pushed bottles and glasses towards Charlie, as he begged him to be seated. "Pray help yourself, sir. You'll find it the very best blood of the grape. I don't know what's come over me, but I'm getting as nervous as a woman." Charlie thought he could guess, and was deeply grieved, but said nothing as he seated himself on one end of the couch, and presently Smallburn turned and stared into his face. "Send I may live, if it isn't Charlie Morris!" he cried. "I was only half awake, you see, and I thought you was some stranger. Welcome to Tatura, my dear fellow." The welcome was hearty, the grip of the hand tight. The man's heart was not quite dead within him. His dull eyes gleamed momentarily. No doubt the sight of Charlie's face brought with it some memories of his lost youth. The two old friends sat and talked long of old days and old friends, and gradually the questions were put and answered until they drifted more into personalities. "How is it you never married, Charlie?" Morris blushed like a girl. "I was very near it a few years ago, but she jilted me. I shall never care for another woman." "Were you so very fond of her then, old boy?" "I was, Caleb. So fond that if it had not been for my good, dear mother, I believe I should have destroyed myself." "For a woman like that? Why, she was not worth it, Charlie." "I suppose not, but we can't help such follies of our youth. I suspect that all men are fools at times, especially where a woman is concerned." "Yes, cursed fools," Smallburn said with energy. "I have never but once regretted my marriage, but it has been every hour and day since I was such a fool." "You married?" Morris said, opening his great grey eyes on his friend. "Why, this is the first I've heard of it." "Is it? I thought I had written of it. Well, it's nothing to be proud of anyway. I made a mistake that has ruined me." Charlie's face looked, as he felt, truly grieved. He began to understand why his old friend lay under the shadow of the great cask, and why his hand shook like an old man's as he raised glass after glass to his lips. Of course, he was too thoroughly honourable to ask one question, but Smallburn went on. "She is an extravagant flirt," he said, "and she's worse. She married me for my money, and she's told me so 100 times lately. She never cared one rap for me. There's some other chap at home that she's fond of to this day, and here she's never satisfied without half a dozen men breaking their hearts for her." "Is Mrs. Smallburn handsome?" Maurice asked absently. "You can see for yourself," Smallburn replied sulkily. "There she goes with her latest admirer. By !" he added with a fierce clench of his fists and a lurid light in his eye. "Patience has its limits, and they'd better look out." Charlie looked toward the open door of the cellar. A broad patch of sunshine lay among the unshaded vines, and through the vines and the sunshine, on a broad avenue, rode a lady on horseback. Her figure, in its plain, beautifully fitting habit of dark cloth, was perfection itself. But as her face was turned toward her attentive cavalier, Maurice could not see it. As they passed to the cellar, the gentleman with her turned a quick glance within it, and then a woman's merry laugh rang among the vines. Smallburn ground his teeth again. "Let us go in," he cried, starting to his feet. "We dine early, and I'd like to be about just now." Again the long-necked bottle was taxed, and with reluctant steps Maurice accompanied his host into the house. Once there, Smallburn himself showed Charlie to his room, and left him, telling him he would come back for him in half an hour. At the advice of his friend Fosbrook, Mr. Maurice had brought with him a small valise strapped before him on the saddle. A larger one was to come up by coach that evening. Pat had made him acquainted with the habits of Tatura in his own emphatic and not over-choice luggage, and he was aware that his valise would supply all his requirements. "Dress for dinner, is it?" cried Pat. "Dress when you get up in the morning, and ondress when you go to bed, and that's all anyone else does up there." When Maurice entered the drawing-room in his host's company, he found there only the gentleman who had escorted Mrs. Smallburn home. Mr. Smallburn made short ceremony of the introduction, and just at that moment a lady entered, a lady of 25 with a handsome proud face, a haughty curl of the lip, and dark languishing eyes that could flash fire at will. She swept her long train into the room, and paused to be introduced to the gentleman from England of whose arrival her husband had informed her. Charlie Maurice turned to meet his hostess, and lifted his pleasant grey eyes to her face. Then a sudden flush of crimson dyed his face up to the very roots of his fair hair. Mrs. Smallburn grew white as dead ashes, and staggered a little. Then she recovered herself as suddenly, and bowed to Charlie. "I have great pleasure in welcoming Mr. Maurice to Tatura," she said, and no more, for her white, trembling lips refused to utter more. Caleb Smallburn, watching the two faces suspiciously, felt himself shudder as though someone were walking over his grave that was to be. What was the reason of Charlie's blush? What was the reason of his wife's pallor? It was but a wretched attempt at conversation during dinner, for all at table were ill at ease and consumed by some of the most powerful passions of our nature. If at that moment, when they left the house after dinner, to return, with Smallburn's wish, to the cellar, one or other had spoken out the thoughts of his mind, all might have been well, but none of the thoughts were spoken. Charlie thought, "I should like to tell poor Caleb, yet how can I? It is her secret, not mine." Smallburn thought, "What is there between them? I'll find out." When they had smoked a cigar or two and drank some blood of the grape out of the long-necked bottles in the cellar, Charlie plucked up courage. "If you wouldn't mind, Caleb," he said, "I should like to ride over to the station and see Constable Fosbrook about that ball. I promised to pay all expenses, you know, and I shouldn't like to disappoint the honest fellow." "Of course, you can have any horse you like out of the stables," Caleb said sulkily, "but it seems to me, that considering you only came a few hours ago, you're in a blessed funk to get away from me." "Couldn't you come too?" Charlie asked, with a strange nervousness for such broad shoulders and strong muscles. "Well, no," Smallburn replied after a pause. "There's a visitor too many inside. I think I'd rather stop at home. But don't mind me, old fellow. Go and see your policeman." The permission was not very gracious, but Charlie was too anxious to get away from Tatura to be particular. As he rode down through the vines and toward the township Fosbrook had pointed out, his big honest heart was heavy with a sorrow which did not belong to him, and he would have given a good many of the hundreds he possessed that it had so happened he had never seen Tatura. Reaching the police station, he tied his horse to the white palings, and opening the gate, entered. There he paused, for from the sounds within he learned his friend Fosbrook had company. He could hear another voice than Fosbrook's, but his new friend was still harping on the old theme. "I wouldn't have missed it for a month's pay, sir. The likes of it'll never be seen again in this colony or any other. 14 emperors, 24 kings, and 64 knights of Jerusalem. There'd be a sight, man. Sure, if a man had seen it, he wouldn't want to see no more in this world. Oh, begorra, here's Mr. Morris." And the honest chap bounced from his seat to receive his most welcome visitor. Picture to yourself the perfect astonishment of Charlie Morris on perceiving that Fosbrook's other visitor was his old schoolmate Clements, and the present detective. Morris drew back as he was entering, but Clements started up and drew him in by the arm. "If I didn't know you better than you know yourself, you great, easy, soft-hearted Charlie Morris, I should be offended. You wouldn't have minded me being a detective one bit if I hadn't arrested that lady fellow passenger of yours. Now, you needn't colour up, you know it's true. If I had said to you, Charlie Morris, I'm not proud of my employment, but though I was a schoolmate of yours at Rugby, there was nothing else open to me, and I must live, in spite of what old Rochefoucauld said, you know you'd have been the very last to call me a hound. Now, wouldn't you?" We may easily guess what the answer of our big-hearted Charlie would be to such a question as that. So leaving him to try and discover Clement's object in following him to Tartara, and find out what had become of Mademoiselle St. Clair, as well as settle with Fosbrook all about the forthcoming ball, let us go back to Tartara. When the sun was hidden behind the western line of tree-clad hills, and the shadows of evening were deeper in the cellars of Tartara, Mr. Smallburn lay upon the couch where Morris had found him. He had seen his wife's friend depart, and told such a piece of his mind to the said wife, that she had trembled with a prevision of terror to the bottom of her weak heart. Then he returned to his favourite retreat among the great casks of his beloved blood of the grape, and resigned himself to the solution of that problem so interesting to him. What secret is it between these two? The long-necked bottles were very near. The shadows were growing deeper. He lay in his usual attitude on his back, with both hands clasped under his head. He thought the problem out, with the fumes of the Malvoisie in his brain, and the perfume of the great casks around him. The one under which he lay bulged out its great bulk over him. Would it have been better that it had burst and deluged out his life, like poor Clarence's in the Tower? All at once the problem was solved. Charlie Morris was the man she loved, 1,000 times better than him in England. "I have it!" he cried aloud, as he started convulsively to his feet in the growing darkness. "I have it!" "What have you, Caleb Smallburn?" a sarcastic voice asked, so close to him that he fell back on the couch. "What have you got? Malvoisie? Hermitage? Shiraz? Bordeaux? Pray, share with a friend." He dared not speak. Was it one of his own wine-born visions of some mocking fiend? He trembled until the big drops grew again on his forehead and listened. "What? Not one word of welcome for an old friend, Caleb? Not one word? Are you dead? You shall be dead some day, you know." Ah, it was some mocking fiend of his dreams. If he could only catch hold of one of those long-necked bottles, he would soon drive that away. He put out his hand and groped in the darkness, and his hand was gripped by another cold and icy as death. With the desperation of terror he seized and held the hand, and then a ripple of low mocking laughter rang through the cellar. He knew where a silver sconce hung, close to his head, when it pleased him to smoke and drink there at night, so, still holding fast the hand which did not seek to free itself, he struck with the other a match against the wall and lit the wax light in the sconce. The wick caught, gleamed and burned up. There was silence in the cellar, and then, with a wildly beating heart, Smallburn turned and looked at his prisoner. What he saw in the face of a woman whose hand he held made him drop the small hand as though it had been hot iron. On the opposite side of the table stood a graceful woman with black hair and a dark-complexioned, stony face. She was simply dressed in black, carried a small valise of American cloth in her hand. It was Mademoiselle St. Clair, of the steamer Malvoisie. "You!" he cried. "You!" "Yes, I, mon cher. Are you not glad to welcome your darling home?" "Mais non. I suppose not, since you had me arrested even before I put my foot on your Australian ground. But you see, my dear, you did not. for I easily proved the forged cheque was a real one you had lovingly sent me all the way from France." "What do you mean?" he asked, as he stared with eyes whose fury would have terrified another woman. "Nothing of you at present, mon cher, save to let you know that when you are dead, fair Tatura will be mine. It's a lovely heritage, my love, and it will be a pleasant change to me to find myself mistress of Tatura. May I say au revoir, or shall it be adieu pour jamais?" He never replied, but the look of fury in his eyes deepened and grew more lurid. But Mademoiselle St. Clair was not afraid of him. She laughed in his face, kissed her hand to him, and glided away in the darkness of the cellar. As Charlie Morris returned from his visit to Phosbrook, just as night was falling, a girl glided from the veranda and put a note into his hand. Charlie was a great coward so far as the fair sex were concerned, and he would rather have met a shower of mitraille than have received that note. He guessed from whom it came, and trembled at what he saw before him. It was his firm determination to leave Tartara on the next day, no matter what a rupture it might occasion with Caleb. He read the note by the light of a stable lantern, as he pretended to be deeply interested about the proper care of the valuable horse he had ridden. It was short, but like the writer, firm as death. "I must see you alone. It is quite useless for you to refuse, unless you wish to render all the life of your schoolmate unhappy. At 11 o'clock tonight I shall await you in the vines at the south side of the cellar." Charlie pushed the note into his pocket. He looked wistfully at the horse he had ridden from town standing contentedly in his stall, and he thought, should he have him saddled and go there and then? But it would look so bad, and there was poor Phosbrook's ball. He went out and walked quickly in the darkness toward the cellar. The light still burned in the silver sconce over Smallburne's head, and he himself sat upon the couch, with a hand gripping either knee. All the long-necked bottles were empty, but there were millions of gallons in the long aisles of the cellar. He looked up as Morris came within the small circle of light, but he did not first speak. "Are you not well, Caleb? You do not look well. What is the matter?" "I've been drinking more than's good for me. Never mind me." "But I do mind you, old fellow. Rouse up and come into the air." "Let me alone," Smallburne said so doggedly, that as he had done on the Malvoisie when his offer of service was so curtly received, Charlie did here. He turned on his heel and walked away. He had drawn out his handkerchief as he stood by the little table, and he left behind him, gleaming white on the dark floor of the cellar, a scrap of folded paper. Caleb Smallburne saw the object with stupid eyes, but at last he rose lazily and picked it up. He staggered as he did so, and recovered himself with an effort. He had no more idea of the value of that bit of paper than that it might be a memorandum of Morris's. Yet it was worth a human life. It was the note Charlie had just received. Smallburne recognised the writing at a glance. As he read it, he knew what the devil had been tempting him all night for. A blaze of fierce passion ran up to the roots of his black hair and almost grew purple, as he once again staggered like a blind man. For a moment, the long rows of casks, which were the wealth of Tattara, grew like a dream to his eyes. He could not see the light in the silver sconce or the silver gleam on the long necks of the empty bottles. At last that terrible purple shade left his face, and gradually he shook himself together. There was not an echo of even a whisper in the cellar, but he went out in the darkness and entered his own room by the window. Charlie Morris strolled through the vines in the darkness, smoking a cigar, the perfume of which did not yet prevent him from inhaling the delightful aroma of growing verdure and fresh earth. He was determined not to enter the house without its master, and we know in what terms he had been dismissed by Smallburne. It was growing late, yet not more than 10 o'clock, and he was just tossing away his cigar with the determination of riding down to get a bed at the township, when a woman's voice fell softly on his ear. "I have forestalled the time, Charlie. I feared you would not meet me." "Your fear was well founded, madam. I was just on my way to the stables for a horse. I could not stay another night under the roof of a friend whose wife has so forgotten herself." "Oh, don't talk so, Charlie. Have you so entirely forgotten the dear old days? I've always loved you, and always will, and you needn't talk to me of a husband whom I hate, a sot, a drunkard, who is never in his sober senses from one year's end to the other. Could one whom you have once loved ever love such a thing as that?" Charlie drew himself away from her persistently clinging hand, just as the big moon rose roundly over the vineyard, and threw her cold beams aslant the vines. When the wretched woman had left her home for the last time, she had not seen a dark figure dogging her soft steps. She had not seen a shadow, darker than the vine behind which it hid, when she spoke to Charlie Morris. But the moon saw it as she rose, and she saw, too, a gleam of her own light on the barrel of a revolver. There was a report on the still air, a shriek and an oath, and Julia Smallburn lay on the soft fresh earth, a bleeding, dying woman. "So much for you, traitress, and I have a barrel left yet," shouted the murderer of Tattara, as he took aim at the horrified Charlie. But at that instant the weapon was knocked from his hand, and he was felled to the ground by a blow from a strong arm. The blow came from the arm of Clements, the detective. The woman was dying, that was evident, even in the light of the rising moon. The bullet had penetrated her chest. She was beyond all human aid. Before they had time even to raise her head, she was gone. Where? Ah, what one of you dares to answer that question? They wondered why Caleb Smallburn never attempted to rise. He lay as the blow of Clements had felled him, with his eyes wide open, staring at the moon, and his breath coming in hard, quick pants. Fosbrook was there now. He was under Clement's orders, and he raised the vigneron from the ground roughly, and tried to stand him on his feet. "Haven't you a leg another, you?" our friend Fosbrook asked, as he administered a good shake. "But faith, I don't wonder at it. Murtherin' villain, stand up, I say." "I can't," the wretched man said. "Oh, what ails me? Oh, what is the matter with me? Take me to the cellar." It was quite evident that he was ill. Strong spasms of pain shook him from head to foot, and made him writhe like a crushed worm. They carried him into the cellar and laid him on his favourite couch, where, with all the great casks of his beloved blood of the grape around him, he drew his last breath of the bouquet of wine. As the last spasm of pain died out of his unconscious limbs, a hollow laugh sounded in the recesses of the cellar. "Be gob, you're all right, Clements," whispered Fosbrook. "She's here. Shut the door." Clements flew to the door and closed it, while Fosbrook seized one of the many lights some of the terrified servants had brought in, and ran toward that part of the cellar from whence had come that horrible laugh. They had not far to seek. Crouching in a corner of the cellar, among the long aisles of great casks, they found Mademoiselle St. Clair, with her black eyes blazing and her black hair wildly dishevelled. She clapped her hands at the sight of light and faces and sprang to her feet. "I'm the Lady of Tatura," she cried. "I'm the mistress of all the green vines." "The devil you are," said Fosbrook coolly. "I told you she was mad," Clements whispered, as he led her toward the couch. "She was his wife," the servants around whispered. "She was his real wife, and he left her in France. Poor thing, no wonder she went mad." "Is that Caleb?" asked the mad woman. "How ugly he is! Cover him up and bury him. I told him he would die, but he did not believe me. Ah, you pretty bottles! Ah, you cunning bottles! How nicely you swallowed the little white crystals in the dark. I'm the Lady of Tatura." Yes, that was the secret. When one cold hand had been gripped in that of her false husband, the other had, in the dark, poisoned his wine. The last drop of Malvoisie he drank had contained deadly poison. Alas! To how many of us is every drop we are foolish enough to drink poison both to body and soul? Let us escape all the dread details consequent on the double tragedy at Tattara, and follow poor saddened Charlie Morris to Melbourne in company with Clements and Fosbrook. The latter had in charge the poor maniac, Mademoiselle St. Clair, who is now in the Yarra Bend Asylum, and, on the interest of Charlie with headquarters, he was permitted to remain in town for the opening of the exhibition. He duly attended the same, and was disgustingly disappointed. "Where's the 14 emperors?" he asked. "And where's the 24 kings? And where's the 64 knights of Jerusalem? Devil a one of me sees anything more than you'd see it any day in Dublin." "Ah, my honest friend," replied Charlie, "you'll find out that there are better things in the world than emperors and kings or even knights of Jerusalem." "Faith, I believe you," cried Fosbrook. I had as fine a dance at the casino below last night as heart could wish for, and everyone told me leg was as straight as it ever was." Long may good Frostbrook dance, independent of kings or emperors, and when Charlie goes to his happy English home, on the next voyage of the stout seabird Malvoisie, may time have soothed his sad memories of Tatura. End of story.